provide a blood sample, and your biopsy is looked at, and clinical data is recorded. And this is just a summary of the different people who are involved in all those stages. So the blood samples are looked at by a number of scientists here. So we've got Claire Harris and Paul Morgan in Cardiff, Edwin Wong, who's been working in the lab here with Tim Goodship and David Kavanagh. We've got Daniel Gale from UCL in London. We've got Matthew, Kevin, and so all sorts of different things are being looked at in the blood samples, both genes and also different proteins in the blood. I've put here that there's a protocol change for 2015. We used to give repeater blood samples every 6 months, and we've changed it because what we want to do is to get as many people as possible into the study, and we think that the first blood sample is the most important, so that we can understand the genes and whether they've got any changes in the blood sample when we enrol them. In an ideal world, we'd probably carry on regardless, getting them from everybody forever. But just logistically, that's quite difficult. So in order to expand the study, we've prioritised getting as many people as we can with these diagnoses into the study with a blood sample, their biopsy looked at, and the important thing is we can collect their clinical data through the radar system forever, as long as you be in radar. So that means we've got long-term follow-up based on what we know about you in the beginning, and that's really crucial. And Steve's going to talk to us more about the radar system. And it's Terry Cook here that looks at the slides, the biopsy slides, to really understand and correlate those with what we're finding in the blood and gene tests. The change this year as well is that this Cambridge bioresource is linked with an IHR. This is part of a big national database of rare diseases, and it's part of the government's real push to understand rare diseases. And the basic message is we're in there. This disease is in that group of conditions that the government's committed to looking at and understanding more about. And all that means is that we need to share with them the DNA samples so that they can do extended, more advanced genetic screening of all the genes in the body, and the data that we get from radar, and that's all in all the consent forms. That's why we have to get re-consent for everybody. But it's very important because it means it increases the power really of what we've been able to do. That's just an overview of you're eligible for inclusion. If you want to be included, you enter radar, and then you enter the study, and then those things happen. So in the study, we want to know, what does the biopsy look like? Are you, does it look like what we would traditionally call this or that or the other? And then what are the specific features? Is it just complement? Is it immunoglobulin? Where is it deposited? And it's Terry Cook in London who's been looking at those to really understand what it looks like. We've been looking for gene changes that might be responsible. And then we've been looking for particular proteins in the blood that might be causing disease. And Kevin will talk more about those when he comes to talk. We've been looking for evidence in the blood that complement is activated. So those are the sciencey bits. But then we're also looking, how did they do? So that eventually we can be saying, okay, well, someone who had that change and that change over 5 years did that. But someone who didn't have either of those changes over 5 years did that. Because as you all know, when you get a diagnosis, you're given that blanket prognosis that everybody gets, that so many % will go to kidney failure in such a length of time. And clearly there are different groups of patients. There are those that do badly very quickly, and those that do well, and stabilise. And what is it about those? And we need to understand more about that. And why did some do okay and others not? This is our recruitment curve. So we opened, as I said, in 2011, and the numbers up the side. So we've currently got 156 patients enrolled from the UK. At the moment, that's been predominantly children. There's over 100 children in that, and that's simply because we prioritised opening it in the centres that had radar active, and that was the paediatric centres to start with. But this year we've had to do another tedious ethical amendment, which is now through, and that means that we're now about to open in many more sites. So I've got a list of sites here. So this is the sites that are currently open or in setup for the national study of MPGN, and you may see your hospital there or you may not, but what I can also show you is the sites that are now open in radar. So this is all the adult and paediatric sites. Steve's going to talk a bit more about this, but that's just to show you that most are either in setup or open for radar now, which means they can then open to this study. So we are very much aware of who's open in radar and who we need to be targeting now to get this study open, so that all patients have the opportunity to enter into the research. You can only enter if your unit is entered in the research. So in terms of future recruitment, we've got more patients in existing sites, we've got sites in setup, we've got new sites coming onto radar, and we have said that we will achieve 300 by April 2017, so that's what we're working to. It's a bit of a number that you just have to plump for, really, but we sort of we felt that how many we felt we could confidently get into the study, because the more patients that we have in the study, the more understanding we're going to get and the more usefulness we're going to get out of the data.
Sally, how many people in the country do you think have actually been diagnosed with it?
So 2 years ago, when we had the family day, that was one of the things that we said, that we were embarrassed that we didn't really know. It's more than 300. I don't know, do you have a feel, Steve, for actual numbers?
When we did the calculation, we estimated it was about 450 in the country, but that was based on population studies and adults and children.
It's probably around that number, but part of the reason for having radar and for doing this is actually to get that number, because until you do that, you just don't know. So, the results I'm going to present are from the initial paediatric, so children's cohort. So when we got the funding from Kids Kidney Research in the beginning, we committed to recruiting 80 children and to do this work for the 80 children. We've been able to expand that and recruit adults, and this work will be replicated and expanded in the adults, but our first data coming through is through that first group of children that we recruited, and to be included we had to have all the data in by last summer, basically, to start our analysis, because we had to do a cut-off somewhere. So this is the classification of what we found on the biopsy. So Terry Cook has, I would say, he's sort of reclassified them, but more according to what we now understand and what the terminology is starting to be for these conditions. So, there are three groups that he's picked out. So he's picked out the pure dense deposit disease here, which is the smallest subgroup. So 17% of those children had pure dense deposit disease. Here on the right, I seem to have gone quiet.
Press button at the bottom, sorry.
Did it run out of power?
It might have run out.
There's another mic down there if you want. On the other side.
This.
Yeah.
Okay. Not my forte. The red light has come on. Okay, can you hear me? Yes. So on the right, the MPGN-IC, that means MPGN immune complex. And that is kind of what used to be MPGN type 1. So that means that when you look at the biopsy, there is evidence of complement and immunoglobulins. So that's these proteins, these immune system proteins. The other half, the DDD, dense deposit disease, and the C3 glomerulonephritis, are those that just predominantly have C3. So they haven't got much of the other proteins that would give you immune complexes. They've just got pure complement. And the difference between dense deposit disease and C3GN is really where it is in the biopsy. So we're tending to start to think of these as more of a group, and so that's your old type 2s plus the newer diagnosis of C3GN being those in which complement is just deposited, and this is the old type 1 rare immune complexes. So it doesn't mean you've got a different disease, it just means we're starting to classify them in a different way, which is lends itself more to understanding what's going on, and that's the reason for that. So you can see that about half of those recruited had old type 1 or MPGN immune complex, and 30% C3GN and 17% dense deposit disease. 5% Terry wasn't able from what he had to classify them, which, you know, is probably the apples looking like oranges and things like that. So this is the age at presentation of the paediatric group that had been recruited prior to last summer. And that just shows that children can present at all ages, as we know, but there seems to be a bit of a predominance during mid-childhood, which many of you will identify with. So at presentation, these children, many of them had low albumin levels with heavy protein in the urine, that's the middle bar, and about a third, well 37%, had abnormal kidney function, so their creatinines were raised at first presentation. We looked at the levels of their complement C3, so that's this complement protein in the blood, and we looked at it according to the different groups, and we can see that you can have a complement C3 level in any of, normal or low, in any of these conditions, but certainly the dense deposit disease group stand out as having the lower C3 levels, this sort of smaller group of patients. We have looked for a protein that we call C3 nephritic factor. Many of you will have heard of that. This has been done in a specific assay, which is a specific test done in Claire Harris's lab in Cardiff. So there are many different tests that are done clinically. Hers is kind of, if there is a nephritic factor, she will find it, whereas some of the others are, some of the lab tests that are done, very diverse tests, and they're all done slightly differently. And so basically, this is if there is one, we should be able to find it to test. The numbers on this are lower because that data is still outstanding at the moment, so we need that data back. But we see that in dense deposit disease, a higher number have this particular protein. And Matthew will probably touch on what that antibody does. Kevin's going to talk to us about, we've been looking for antibodies against some of the complement proteins. So there's a complement protein called factor H, Matthew will tell you about that. We've been looking to see if patients have got an antibody against that to stop it from working. And we found that some patients do have that in this group, and Kevin's going to talk to you more about that. So 14 out of 81 that were tested, because not everybody's had every testing. One of the surprising findings for us was that we've got relatively few people who've got genetic changes in the complement genes. So in terms of what complement does, Matthew's going to tell you about that, but we thought that we were going to find a higher percentage of patients who had abnormality in their complement genes. So something about how they were made that meant that they make their complement proteins the wrong way. We found that only 6 out of the total patients that we were able to test had got these variants in the complement genes. So it's a very low percentage. Some of the other series, the French series, found about 16 to 20%. But it is a bit debatable about some of the changes, whether they truly are abnormal or just variants that happen in the normal population. So there was a bit of debate about that with genetic tests. But really the message here is that we found very few underlying genetic problems. And that kind of goes with the fact that most people don't have MPGN and these conditions running in families. There are very few people who it's like clustering in a family. It's mostly hits one person, and so that does go with that. So if you add up the abnormalities that we've currently looked for, which was the anti-factor H antibodies, the C3 nephritic factor and complement gene mutations, we find quite a very high level of complement abnormalities in particularly the DDD group. So 87.5% of them have got a complement problem that we can detect. it's 45% in the C3GN group and 66% in the immune complex or sort of type 1 group. This is a graph that just looks at what we call renal survival. So that's a technical term for basically not developing kidney failure. So if your renal survival is 100%, you haven't, nobody's developed kidney failure. And the way that this graph works is that, this is the people in who we've got data to follow through, that according to those 3 different groups, so if you take the black line, that's the immune complex or the type 1s, that really very many of those maintain very good kidney function. Only 1 patient is actually in that group of the cohort that we've looked at has gone into end-stage renal failure. But don't forget that the follow-up is not massive. These are children, so and many of them will have not been diagnosed. They might have been entered 2 years after they presented or less, so haven't got long-term follow-up there. The C3GN group, it's down to about 70% renal survival of the patients that were in this group, and then density deposit disease, which doesn't surprise us, that these are consistent with published literature. So where now? This big expansion continues because we've got to get as many people as we can in while we've still got funding. We have got this genome sequencing going on with the NIHR, which they will come back and give us data and say we've found gene changes in such and such in some of your patients, genes that we might never have thought of because we never thought of testing them. So that's a very important bit of data to come back. We need to replicate some of what we've been doing in the children's group in the adult cohort, and to get more data, more patients. We'll be able to do much more with the data because, you know, when you've only got 2 or 3 patients in a group, one slight change. How can you infer like what from 1 patient out of 3? But if you've got 10, then you can start to make more conclusions about it. We are really wanting to work with our international colleagues in getting as much of the data from the UK to work with colleagues internationally to get a bigger cohort of patients with these rare diseases. I would say that we are getting ready to go so that when we have commercial approaches, so drug companies come and saying this is a particular drug, I've started to get the odd email that you know, sort of people know we've got a cohort. There's nothing definite coming through, but started to get approaches from commercial companies asking about would we be interested in, and it's more that they usually want to discuss a particular therapy and whether it might be appropriate and things. We're starting to get that sort of approach, so that I'm really pleased about that because it means that drug companies know that we have a cohort ready for trials, and we need to think what we do beyond 2017 when this funding runs out. There's a conference coming up in the next month where this is another example of how this is being prioritised. So KDIGO is kidney disease, improving global outcomes, and there's a conference in which internationally we'll be coming together to focus on what are the key areas for research that we need to go forward on internationally, and a number of us will be contributing to that. So that's another sign that this condition is you know, on the international agenda. And how can you guys help spread the word in your renal unit? So if you've not been asked if you want to go into the study, ask your consultant, are we in radar? Can I enter the national study of MPGN and C3G, or whatever you could call it, the MPGN study, they'll know what you mean. And get into radar, get into the study. You're very good at making your voices heard, I think, and keep doing that because you need to be saying this research must be done. And if you guys are saying research must be done, it helps us get the funding in order to carry on doing the research.
Just on that point, there's obviously patients and members that the actual local trust don't have anything to do with radar.
Yeah.
They're not registered, they're not obviously budget for it. Now, some of the questions that some of the members were asking last night actually.
Yeah.
How do they, if they're not registered and the local trust ain't willing to do it, where do they go, and obviously information wise?
So I've got all the data on what trusts are now open to radar and which aren't. So I think if, and we can have a look, if you want to come and find me, your you're not open to radar, or Steve as well, we can try and help, because we can put some pressure from our end too to say, look, your patients want to be in radar, can you open? And it's radar is not particularly, it depends on IT systems and things like that, but it often needs enough people to say, we really want this, for it to go up, I think as I said last year, up the priority list for the unit. It might not currently be their highest priority, but because they might have other priorities, but you can help make it their priority by, and all the units will be on radar eventually, but we need to get it sooner.
So to get registered, do you have to have a biopsy?
Back in the beginning. So we
go-
look way back.
Obviously,
So,
Matt doesn't want to have
yeah.
a biopsy.
oh no, absolutely. You don't need. All you need to do is sign a consent form. Obviously, read through the information, understand what you're signing up to. Sign a consent form, and then the research team there will go back and find your original biopsy. And the next time you have a blood test done, you'll have an extra 10 to 20 mils taken off to send to the research. And if you're happy to stay in radar, then your data will keep going into radar, and every now and again we'll get download of that data. So, and then your samples go off to the guys in the labs, and they'll be looking at things. So it's easy study to enter.
Do we as a family get to see the results of this
Yes, and
individual?
yes, so what I'm working actively on, and I haven't managed to achieve it yet, is to get feedback to all of the consultants of all the patients who we have completed the investigations on so far, to say, in your patient radar, I won't know who they are, but radar number 27 whatever, has got the following: no gene changes, positive antibody, or whatever. I must say that we don't know, so for example with the positive anti-factor H antibodies, and Kevin will talk a bit more about it, we don't know what that really means in this condition, and whether treating that would change anything. And this is research, so when we're presenting the results back to the local clinicians, it's not like they can go, right, well we now know what to do with that result. We feel that we should pass it on, but we don't know what that means for treatment. I couldn't say, well, you must clearly do this treatment, because we just don't know what it actually means. But it's part of building a bigger picture.
Thank you.
Any other questions from anybody?
Can I just ask if there are any units within the Yorkshire and Humber area that aren't involved in this? If you could let me know, I'll take it to the Strategic Clinical Network that I'm part of.
Yeah.
So if there are any that need a kick up their backside to join,
Yeah.
just let me know and I'll take it to the SCN.
And again, just on that side as well, then through the NKF, I mean, is it something that with the other, obviously Southern advocates can get involved
Yes.
and push on, obviously, prime example, Southampton?
That isn't,
I
another
think-
way
Yeah.
through the NKF, if
Yeah.
is that it's patient voice. If you
Yeah.
guys want to be on radar, then it's encouraging that to happen.
I think Southampton's actually registered, and
Southampton
Evelina's
is
and
on
Guy's.
Just
Yeah.
a unit that don't
Yeah.
so,
I was thinking of South.
So, Sam, should we start asking when we go to clinic for those results, or that just come through?
They will all come through. I keep saying soon. It is soon, and I know I should have got them to you before now, but it is. They will get them, and then you can ask.
Would they be expecting them, or is it something now?
Yeah, so they all knew that at some point when the research was completed, that they would get feedback on the results. Right? Yeah.
Roughly how long does that take to get all the results back from, say, you taking the first
It can be a long time, and even now we're less in control of the genetic results, because the genetic results are all going to the bioresource. They're sequencing every gene. We were just doing complement genes, so it makes no sense to spend hundreds of pounds sequencing complement genes, and someone else is spending a little bit more to sequence all the genes. So we're no longer in the current ones that we're accepting now doing the complement screening. We're waiting for the results to come back from the whole genome screen, and we have less control, but we'll get much richer data. So I would always say to clinicians, if you really want to know the answer to, for example, the gene mutations, if you're working up to treatment decisions that you really need to know, then that test can always be done clinically by the laboratory in Newcastle, and the clinician would just pay for that test. But if it's going to affect clinical care, then that would be the way to do it. So we've always said we don't know when we'll feed back, but we will feed back, which is the difference between research tests and clinical tests.
Can I just quickly ask Sally? Obviously, with some children that start off at an early age, but then they might go over to another hospital and transition.
Yeah.
The result would go back to the initial children's hospital.
Yes.
It would eventually find its way.
Yes, yes. So any paediatric nephrologist who received the result on a patient that they'd already transferred would immediately, I speak for myself, but I'm sure Steve would immediately just pass on results. It's no point in sitting with it. I think we're quite good at just passing on to because we would know who we transferred to.
The actual treatment for MPGN, is it still steroids, or has that changed at all?
Unfortunately, we're not a lot further forward. Steroids is still the sort of first